familiar with Chronicles. Let me put it that way. You probably don't know how much David contributed and planned for this temple that is completely passed over in the book of Kings. And it's in 1 Chronicles 22 all the way through chapter 29. 6 or 7 chapters, just nothing but exclusive what David did and planned and arranged the Levites. He arranged the singers. He arranged everything and then told Solomon, this is what you do. This is what you do. This is how you do it. And all of the money that he contributed, when I say money, I mean gold, and various other contributions. And I started to go through that tonight, but that's going ahead of us into another book. But begins in 1 Chronicles 22 and runs all the way through 1 Chronicles 29 to try to learn exactly how much David contributed. So Solomon, I guess what I'm trying to say is that Solomon had it all laid out. He had it all laid out. David made the plans, apparently the floor plan, everything.
Architect.
Yeah, he was an architect, correct. He performed the work of an architect in this temple and said, Solomon, here's the plan. Go do it. And Solomon went and did it. But anyway, we're in 1 Kings chapter 6. And it says that it came about in the 480th year, and I'm paraphrasing, after the Exodus. And my guess on the Exodus is 1447 BC. Okay, which brings us, what, to 967 for, I've got actually 968. But anyway, some of these dates are variable. So 1447 was what I believe was right around the date that Moses and the Israelites crossed out of Egypt. And we're at the 4th year of Solomon's reign in 967 according to Billy, 68 according to me. And good. Okay, moving right along. All right, verses 2 through 10. We're looking at the outer structure of the temple. This is all having to do with the building itself, none of the furnishings. We learn in verse 2 that the overall size, it was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high, which, if you do a little math, is 2,700 square feet. Betty and I live in a house that's about 1,750. So that gives you some idea of what that took up square foot wise. Now that was the holy place and the most holy place, both together. We learn in verse 3 that it had a 30-foot long and 15-foot wide. I'll call it a front porch, for lack of a more dignified term. It looks like it had 2 or 3 chambers or side rooms built around the side and possibly across the back, probably for storage, probably for priests, and whatever was needed to be stored that was connected with the upkeep and the work that went on within the temple every day. In verses 11 through 13, the Lord decides it's time to give Solomon a reminder and tells him that you be sure that you obey my word and remember my promises, because I keep my promises. And I'm going to live among the Israelites in verse 13 when you get this temple built, just like I promised. Now, encouraged, I guess, by the promise that God had just made, Solomon now proceeds with the interior portion of the temple. Verse 15, the walls were lined with cedar. Now, where did that come from? Lebanon, Hiram, yes. The floor was covered with, and the translations vary, mine has cypress. The most holy place begins in verse 16 through 20, was partitioned off from the rest of the building with vertical cedar planks. Now in the tabernacle, what was the partition? The curtain. Okay, I think we're gonna run across a curtain here again. I think there still was a curtain there. Okay, but this was David's plan as carried out by Solomon. The interior in verse 18 was covered with cedar, and all the woodwork was delicately carved, and all of those stones which had been worked at the quarry and brought in and used for the foundation were completely covered with wood so that none of it was visible. The most holy place in verse 20 was 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 30 feet tall. And in Revelation 21, when it talks about the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, it's called the city four square, which means a perfect cube. So it was an exact image of the most holy place in the temple. Now, if you remember back in, verse 2, I told you that the building was 45 feet high, and the holy place was only 30 feet high. So apparently what he did was drop the ceiling down from the roof in order to make the most holy place perfectly square cube. So the roof was still 45 feet high, but the ceiling of the most holy place was only 30 feet high. Okay, verse 20 again tells us that it was covered with wallpaper. It was covered in gold. The altar of incense in verse 20 was also overlaid in gold. The inside of the main part of the temple had gold chains which decorated the entrance, probably over the top of the entrance of the most holy place, that 30 by 30 by 30 square at the end. The interior of the main part of the temple was also covered with gold. Verse 23 through 28 tells us about a couple of cherubim, or animals, figures with wings, winged angelic beings, made of wood. They were 15 feet high in verse 23, so they were exactly half of the height of the cube back there, okay? Each wing of each of the two creatures was 7.5 feet wide. They were placed side by side, facing the front or the entrance of the most holy place. So their wings did what? They touched each other, but they also went from wall to wall. 4 times 7.5 is 30. So each one creature from tip to tip was 15 feet. And they touched each other, and then both of them touched the opposite wall. So they covered the entire width of the most holy place. Yes?
You did a great job there, because most pictures you see, artist conceptions of this, have them facing each other.
No, it says they face the front.
That's right. But most of the artists...
Well, I guess it's because they're used to the ones sitting on top of the mercy seat over the Ark of the Covenant face each other with their wings, as I'm remembering now, outstretched, touching the other cherubim's wing. Now, those two are still there. They are part and parcel of the Ark of the Covenant. Those two smaller cherubim are still there, reaching across and touching each other as they sit on the lid, or the holy place, the Ark of the Covenant, the lid, and there's a word for that, Billy. Mercy seat. Thank you. Okay, let's see. They were in verse 28, also overlaid in gold.
It's made from an olive tree. Do we know
Olive.
what that is?
Olive wood. That's all I know. It was very expensive, I know that. Olive wood covered with gold. Yeah. Let's see. Now, Brother Kaufman is not happy with the way Solomon built this, by the way. Let me tell you, he says, quote, "It is perfectly clear to any unbiased observer that Solomon was doing his own thing here and not the will of God." And what does he think he objects to here?
Gold.
Possibly,
ornate.
possibly. Well, what do you think about the possibility that he's added two cherubim that were not in the original setup? So now we have 4 in there. Moses' instructions from God only had 2, so now he's put 2 big ones and the 2 original small ones in there, and Brother Kaufman doesn't like that.
Well, as long as Lloyd is okay with it, we really don't care what Brother Kaufman.
Well, that's true. That's true.
And God certainly didn't show any opposition to it.
No, you can mark, it's 1 Kings 9:3, where God obviously expresses and demonstrates his approval for everything that was done, because he decides that he's going to live with it. So he doesn't have a problem with the 2 additional cherubim or the outlandish, ornate, gold, expensive.
Moved it out of the way, I think.
Sorry?
If God didn't want them there, he'd have moved them out of the way, or had them.
I would have thought so, yeah.
Lloyd Josephus, of course, didn't live and see the original, but in his attempt to describe it, he said it was probably one of the most fabulous buildings of the ancient world.
I can believe it. After, when you go through, and I didn't go through all the details, I just gave you the high points of this chapter. When you consider that the floor is gold, the walls are gold, and then they're overlaid with gold. And then carving with, I think there was image of cherubim and open flowers and something else.
Palm trees.
Palm trees, thank you. I couldn't remember that third one. But it was,
The upper story windows letting in light, it would be absolutely dazzling in the sunlight.
the clear story, yeah, that was, I didn't bring that up because that is subject to a lot of debate about the open windows that went around what I call clear story. In fact, there is not nearly enough here to sit down and replicate this building at all. And if you've looked in your dictionaries, your Bible dictionaries, you'll see very different representations of understandings of what is being written down here, because it's not designed to have anything built from it. David gave that to Solomon. We're just getting kind of the high points here. In fact, I was really surprised. I read one famous, and I can't remember who it was, who is sure that it had the same roof that the Noah's Ark had on it. Curved. But you can't tell. Anyway, so don't be dogmatic on this.
That's like the tabernacle. The description of it, and you'll see all kinds of different drawings with flat roofs, with pitched roofs, with all kinds of them, just different looks to it, just because nobody took a picture.
Right, and we don't have the detailed plans. Right, and weren't intended to have the detailed plans of either. That's why you've got so many varied interpretations of what both the tent, the tabernacle looked like, and of course the temple. Let's see, verse 29, the walls inside were covered. I just mentioned that. The floors were covered with gold. The door jambs were made of the same olive wood that you brought up. Verse 31 and 32, and were carved and overlaid in gold. By the way, the curtain, which is not mentioned in Kings, is mentioned in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 3:14. So we didn't lose the curtain out of the tabernacle. It was brought in, or not brought in, but there was a curtain made, in spite of the fact that there were doors there. Okay, let's see. 33 through 35 tells us that there were 2 doors for the main entrance, that is out in the holy place, how you come into the building, and they were carved and overlaid in gold. 37 and 38 tells us that the specifications that David gave Solomon were carried out just like it was supposed to be, and the entire building of the temple took, what did I say, 7 years. Okay, we covered that chapter. Any questions upon this? It's easy to say the floors were covered with gold and then just move on.
Lloyd,
But that's just absolutely amazing.
Lloyd,
and the
Were
walls.
some of these craftsmen given special talent by God to perform these duties?
Well, they were for the tabernacle. I don't remember God being responsible for hiring.
Now, the Hiram that does the work is just one
Skill.
Right.
That was only for the tabernacle. Okay, that it's said. There's nothing that was said about that, about the temple, although it could have been, but it's not mentioned if it was.
Were these stones taken into the temple, some of them, and not the sound of a hammer?
Yeah.
Were prepared by David, I guess.
David had, I'm sure David started it at
That was
least.
part of his duties to get things prepared.
Yep.
And carry them into the temple.
Yep.
And they were fit perfect.
Yes.
Hiram's men would be that stones. But you know, that's what amazes me, that they cut those stones so intricately, as large as they were. I'm judging by what the little part that's left, anyway, that they were cut so intricately that the knife blade wouldn't pass between them. However, then they were covered with wood and gold.
Yes. Expensive wood. Yeah. Okay, chapter 7, some more building tonight. We're going to look at the palace complex that Solomon built and the furnishings that go in the temple, which is now finished. Only the main building is finished. Now, as we go through this, and we'll go through it pretty quickly, there were 5 buildings in this complex. Our information is so sketchy that we can't tell whether it's one building or it's a group of buildings connected to each other. I mean, whether it's a group of separate buildings or a group of buildings which were connected to each other. We can't tell, so that's why I use the term complex. And we've got verse 1, the house of the forest of Lebanon, which was obviously made with cedar. That's in verses 2 through 5, and it, as we'll learn later, probably or could have been used as an armory, because that's where the golden shields that Solomon had made go. Verse 6 is the pillar hall or colonnade, if your translation has that. The third building is the throne room and judgment hall in verse 7. And this is the room that was probably used when who visited Solomon a little later? Sheba. Yes, Queen Sheba. And then, of course, in verse 8, you have Solomon's own personal house and the house he built for Pharaoh's daughter. So those are the 5 buildings that are involved in all of these verses in chapter 7. Hiram, verse 13 and 14, was brought in. This is not the king that David and Solomon have dealt with. This is a craftsman, very skilled craftsman who works especially in bronze, who was brought in from Tyre to do the work that Solomon wanted done. But he's not the king. He's a workman. And let's see, in verses 15 through 22, he builds 2 bronze pillars. Now, I want you to get the size of these things. They are 27 feet high and 18 feet around. 27 feet high, 18 feet around. Now, on top of those, 7.5 feet high each, are 2 bronze capitals, decorative caps, 7.5 feet high, decorated and covered with gold like the rest of it that we'll learn later. Let's see, they were 17.5 feet high, so that makes those 7.5, so that makes those columns 34.5 feet tall total.
It'd be about 6 feet across.
Is that 6 feet across with the 18-foot diameter? Okay. No, you said diameter, didn't you? I said circumference, 18
Circumference.
Yes.
Looks like that circumference would be about 6 feet.
diameter. Okay. That's a tall, that's a big column. That is in fact, they gave them names, Boaz and Yeah. And they were set at the sides of the temple's main entrance in verse 21 and given names. Verses 23 through 26, this same Hiram made a large round water tank, which is called the Sea, S-E-A. And probably for use of the priests in their ritual cleansings, various. Billy?
Backing up just a second.
Yeah.
Jason, you shall establish,
Established, yeah.
which would, the J would be a Y, Yahweh will establish.
Okay.
And then Boaz means strength.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right.
So, fitting names for what they expected Yahweh to do for them.
Yes, for such a magnificent structure, yeah. All right, this sea was made out of cast metal. It was 7.5 feet deep, 45 feet around it. One estimate has that it held about 11,000 gallons of water. The sea was on a base of 12 oxen, 4 facing each direction. And the sea was set on top of the oxen.
That would be about 15 feet across.
Okay?
When you think of above ground pools, or a big trampoline, that's about the size of it is across.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Take a picture of the across of it.
It may be a good pool at 7.5 feet deep too. A great pool, yeah. Let's see, verse 20, oh, I've already mentioned that. And, let's see, verses 27 through 39 tells us about some bronze water carts, 12 of them, 6 feet by 6 feet by 4.5 feet high. That was the frame size. And there were 10 basins or bowls, if you please, that set down in the frames of each one, and they were on wheels. What do you think those were for? Some more washings, perhaps washing of the sacrifices. And if you needed water, and it was in that 11,000 gallon sea, and you want it over here, what do? You don't move that sea. You use these basins on wheels. And there was a dozen of them, what did I say, 10 of them. 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4.5 feet high. Probably for washing burnt offerings, we're not sure. But when you're sacrificing that many sheep and cattle and doves every day, yes, it is a nasty, bloody job that requires a lot of water where the water is needed. And that's why there were 10 of these bronze water carts, and they probably got the water from the sea and dipped it in there, I suppose, and then refilled the sea, I'm guessing. Somebody estimated that each basin held about 220 gallons of water. And in verse 40, it tells us that Hiram also made all of the smaller utensils, the basins, the shovels, and the bowls that were necessary for these sacrificial, same rites, this killing of the sheep and the oxen and the goats and so forth, and the fires that were required to burn them on the altar of burnt offering, and to shovel the ashes and to carry things off, and so on and so forth. And verses 48 through 50 list the, lampstand and the table on which the bread of the presence, or the showbread, as I was, what I grew up hearing it called. All of the rest of the furnishings are listed in those 3 verses. And then in verse 51, Solomon puts the items that David had saved when he was alive and promised or dedicated to the treasury of the temple. Now, I assume that all of those items like that, like what David dedicated, went in those side rooms, which were 2 or 3 stories. I think they were 7.5 feet wide, running around either 2 or 3 of the walls of this building. And I think that's where they were stored and such. Okay, chapter 7's in our rear view. Yes, sir.
What, was there any symbolism of the oxen while they were all facing in different directions?
Not that I know of. I'm not aware of it.
Was most of this work done by the Levites?
Sir?
Was most of this work that you're talking about done by the Levites?
No, it was done by Hiram and his men. It wasn't done by the Levites. The Levites hadn't been introduced into the temple yet. The only use the Levites have had with this, will have with this, is the first thing that they'll have to do with it is to bring the Ark of the Covenant in. And that's the first time we'll see the Levites in connection with this building. But not so far. Yes, Mike?
I just finished reading some of the Exodus part about the tabernacle, and he asked about the oxen. They got three, and facing in the various
Four winds.
compass.
Yeah.
Wasn't that? There was some description there, I believe, about how the tribes of there's 12, so there's 12,
Well, yeah.
how they were organizing their camps
Oh.
around the tabernacle.
Yeah, but I
I
don't
wonder
know.
if that's not some similarity or symbology there.
Well, it could be. It could, because there was a detailed layout of how they were to count
And I think it was three
every time they stopped.
around the four sides of the
Right.
tabernacle.
He asked me about why did they pick the ox. I don't know. Strength, I guess, to hold up all that water.
That would be impressive, a hand's breadth width of the sea, that would be so impressive.
Yes. Yeah, and then, yeah.
Actually, sir, my question was why they were facing the different
Oh, okay.
directions. Yeah, and I think you hit on it.
Okay, now he did. He
That
did.
might be.
Mike did,
Yeah.
probably, yeah. Any further questions on chapter 7?
I like the very first verse, the very last verse of 6, and the very first verse of 7. That, and it points it out, he took 7 years of building the temple, and he spent 13 years on his own.
Yeah, that's true.
It was.
Okay, but he
slightly
did-
over 27.
Sir?
His was slightly over 2,700 feet though, in square feet.
Well, the temple was one building.
Yeah.
The rest of these were 4 or 5 additional buildings. But you're right, there's people.
But and this Bible too, it's got the big word, but Solomon was building his own house 13 years. And this kind of struck me as all I did.
Yeah. Well, you can also look at it this way. Solomon probably had no one to make all the preparations for all these other buildings like David had done. He probably had no plans and had not lined up the help for it like the prep and all the work that had been done in the temple. But that could very well be. We just don't know. But it was a lot more building than simply building the temple. And I don't mean simply, but building the temple.
He had his priorities straight up.
For a while he did.
Yeah.
For a while he did, yeah. Yeah, he built the temple first. And I bet you the next thing in line was the Queen's building. The Egyptian closet. Yeah. All right, chapter 8. What we talked about earlier, since the outside is finished, the inside is now finished and ready for God to move into. The king summons all the leadership of Israel, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 8, to move the ark into the temple. And remember, it's been at Gibeon, I believe, just north of town.
The ark is in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, the tabernacle is at Gibeon. Thank you. Yeah, it's sitting in that tent David made for it down in Zion, where he originally conquered that area. It's during the Feast of the Tabernacles, and I'm sure that was probably a deliberate choice by Solomon in September and October. And the priests in verse 3 and 4 carry the ark of the tabernacle from the old tabernacle with all of its furnishings, all the old tent and its furnishings, including the ark, up to the temple which was about 3/4 of a mile away from the south, and so they didn't have to move it far. Look at, let's see, I think it's verse, yeah, they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle, and all the holy utensils which were in the tent. Now, did they use all of this in the new temple building or not? They did not. They had all new items, all new utensils, new table, new altars, new everything. The only thing that came, as far as I can tell, out of the tabernacle that they had been carrying around for hundreds of years was the Ark of the Covenant. That was it. The rest of the items probably went into storage, the tent itself, and all of these other items, in one of those rooms, those storage rooms built around the side. And it probably sat there until the temple was burned in 586 or 585, about 400 years down the road. So that was verse 4. And verse 5 is something we need to really notice. The kings and all the leaders offered a large number of sacrifices as that ark was being moved. Why did they do that? Speculate.
David had done the same thing. Well, and
For this-
also the bad results the first time.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes, if we make a mistake here, maybe we can cover it over, or God will forgive us if we offering all of these sacrifices as we're moving this thing that 3/4 of a mile. So the first thing they did was start appeasing God in case we make a mistake here, because it wasn't that long ago that David had that problem with, what was the man's name that was killed? Uzzah. Thank you. Yes,
They didn't use a cart this time.
sir?
They didn't use the cart this time.
No, they did it the way it was supposed to be done, yes, the 2 times before, yeah. So in verse 6 through 10, the priests, and here's the first mention of the priest said, place the ark inside that 30 by 30 by 30 most holy place. And it mentions that the only thing inside the ark at that time were the 2 tables of the 10 Commandments that Moses had received, 450 years ago, roughly? Same 2 tables were in the, that was all that was there. Verse 10 through 13, the cloud of God's presence and His glory filled the temple, indicating what on God's part? His approval and His presence. Yes, I'm moving in. I'm moving in. I'm happy with what you've done, and I'm going to take up residence here. Clay.
Did they use different poles to move it with? Because in
Different what?
different poles to carry it with, because it says in verse 8 that the poles extended so that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the outside.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate and confusion about that, because if it protruded through the door in the new place, why didn't it protrude through the curtain in the tabernacle? Because the dimensions were the same, right? So I don't know, that verse is a mystery verse to me. But apparently it was not considered a violation by the man that was going to move into the temple and live there. But the other 2 poles, and it set sideways, didn't it? Of the door, parallel to the door, not pointing out to the door. So that, I'm very confused about that verse. That's why I skipped it, because it didn't seem to be all that important in the first place. But now, if God had had a real problem with it, we would have discussed it. But it just says that the poles were able to be seen from the outside, and that would be from the holy place. You could look around in there and see the tips of the poles, which were used to carry the Ark of the Covenant from the outside. Don't have any idea.
Now, you want the rest of the tradition?
Yes.
Supposedly, the rock on which the Ark of the Covenant sat was the rock that formed the basis of the altar that Abraham built to offer Isaac.
Yeah, it was Samson, Moriah.
And
Yeah,
in the Muslim mosque, the dome of the rock, you can see the rectangle shape, and it is exactly the shape and dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant.
okay,
And yet they say the temple wasn't even there.
okay. Well, the Arabs say that.
Yeah, the Arabs say that.
Lloyd, over Lord's Cold Week, Brother Wire got a kid at the tabernacle, and we built that tabernacle in the church building over there.
Did you? Full
It
size?
was amusing to see. He was a craftsman. That was something to see, man. It was small, but
Okay,
we
I
built
hope.
that tabernacle. It was amusing to see.
Well, everybody carried it according to the law, didn't they? Nobody was killed? I'd have been hesitant about
It
that.
was a craftsman.
Are you a priest? Are you, okay, have you been legally certified to carry this stuff and to do these things?
So I can truthfully say I helped build the tabernacle.
Oh, okay. All right,
Well, John built one day for me,
yeah, yeah. Well, let's see, okay, we're out of time again, my goodness. We will pick up with verse 11, where God's presence is made in such a way that there is absolutely no doubt that the main tenant, the only tenant, has moved in and has approved of all the work that has been done. Any comments or questions? We got that temple and 4 or 5 other buildings built in one night. And we got the ark moved, ready for the Lord.
It makes me think about the early days of, when we, and the county made do most of it. And they would go down to the field house, or somewhere high, and take a bath. And I.
County workers, man, and that's on the job.
Yeah. And I picked 3 of them. I said, when y'all leave the lunchroom on, don't crank no machine and make noise and you know, and after.
Aggravating.
Aggravating. And it pushed him, I think they set a record for the quickest, you know, they got down there and got to work. Because some boys were just aggravating and they,
Yeah,
that's the only way we could get it done.
really?
Yes, sir. It was something else. I picked the good ones too.
Did you? Okay, okay. You were doing a little harassing.
Yes.
Yeah. Anything else? Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful for the study of the temple, and we are happy tonight to recognize that we are indeed the temple that you live in now. And we are so thankful for your presence and your guidance that you give us, and help us to always remember that you live inside of us. And we thank you for all of your blessings, and for Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.